Okay, welcome everybody. I'll let our guests into the room. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator. And tonight we are very pleased to bring you the launch of the Contemporary American Essay by Phillip Lopate. He'll be in conversation with Leslie Jamison and Margo Jefferson. Sharing a link to buy signed copies in the chat right now. If you have any questions, you can use the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they'll take your questions at the end of the event. And I'll introduce them now. Leslie Jamison is the New York Times bestselling author of The Recovering, The Empathy Exams, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and a novel, The Gin Closet. She is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine and teaches at Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn with her daughter. Margo Jefferson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic, is the author of On Michael Jackson and Negroland, which won the 2015 National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. She has been a staff writer for the New York Times, lives in New York, and teaches in the writing program at Columbia University. Phillip Lopate is the author of the essay collections Against Joie de Vivre, Bachelorhood, and Portrait of My Body, among other books. He is editor of Art of the Personal Essay and Writing New York, among others, and his film criticism appears regularly in the New York Times and other publications. He lives in Brooklyn. All right, I'll hand it over.
You're muted. There we go.
This book, The Contemporary American Essay, is the third in a set of books that I edited about the American essay. And the first one is called The Glorious American Essay and attempts to traverse the entire arc of the American essay from the Puritans, Cotton Mather, to Zadie Smith. The second one is much more focused on the period of the post-war period, 1945 to 1970, and that's called the Golden Age of the American Essay. And this third one, the Contemporary American Essay, is devoted to essays of the 21st century. Now, I have to admit that this third one, I was a little scared to do. Partly because, you know, when you're doing anthologies, the further back in time you go, the more certain you are. So, you know, it doesn't take much to know that Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry David Thoreau or Margaret Fuller or James Baldwin belong in an essay collection. But when you get to the contemporary scene, we don't really know what is lasting from what is trendy or fashionable. It's much harder to see one's contemporaries than the long ago dead, who are much more cooperative, especially in terms of allowing for permissions and not charging to be reproduced and things like that. Anyway, but when you get to the contemporary scene, I thought this could either be scary or it could be fun. And I think it's both, because what it meant for me was to place some bets and to try to find essays that I believed in and that were exciting and meaty. And I'm very happy with the results, I have to say. I like this book a lot. It's different from the others because it doesn't have this this patina of the canonic yet, you know. So there's something very fresh about it, to my mind. And as I was going through it again when I got my first copies, I was astonished at the number of powerful pieces in it. Which bodes well for the essays that people are writing now. It seems to me to be a very lively moment for the genre. So if I could put my fellow panelists on the spot, I'd like to ask them what they thought of the book, aside from your own selections.
Well, I was relieved I didn't have to be angry at you for forgetting to include me, Philip.
By the way, I've already gotten some pissed off responses from friends of mine who I didn't put in the book. So that is one of the problems when you're dealing with the contemporary.
Oh, yes, but not ours, fortunately, this particular evening, because all three of us are
in the book.
Yeah.
I even put myself in the book because for the first two volumes, people kept saying, well, aren't you going to put one of your own essays in? And I thought, no, not yet. And I also was so jealous of the number of pages, and I always wanted to give it to other writers. But finally, I broke down and decided to include one of my own.
Yeah.
So,
you know, you go every which way in terms of the 21st century. You know, you push at absolutely those porous boundaries where the non-fictional becomes the wholly, in certain ways, fictional. You are very good at the range of subjects, from that tiny, particular, idiosyncratic experience that a writer, and I think of that in some ways as more tied to the traditional essay. A writer is saying, and it's, bear with me, you know, I am so particular and peculiar, you know, that the way I talk about this odd thing will fascinate you. But then there are these grand sweeping, you know, I am summing up, you know, a culture, a thematic obsession. At least you cover all of that very well. What I wanted to ask you was, what really, what was the shock of the new as you moved from not only, you know, the 17th century essays that are in the first one, but through your education as an essay reader, what you know did you essentially grow up with as its virtues, and what has rattled and excited you and thrown you off and maybe made you think, I didn't think the essay was ever going to quite do this? You know, what confines has it burst that surprised you?
Well, I mean, first of all, in my role as an anthology essayist, I can be much more. I try to be much more open to styles and forms that are not necessarily mine. You know, so for instance, if I were just reading casually, you know, I might pick up a book of essays and say, "No, this is not my kind of thing."
Yeah.
But if I'm editing an anthology, I think, well, it may not be my kind of thing, but let me see if I can appreciate it on its own terms. So this is a moment of high experimentation in the essay, it seems to me. You know, you, Margo, have taught the hybrid essay, and there are various hybrid essays in here.
Yeah.
So certainly something that exists on the cusp between nonfiction and fiction, like Hilton Al's piece in which he's channeling Louise Brooks.
Which is your opener.
It's my opener. It's my opener for no other reason that I was listing people alphabetically and Hilton came first, you know. I thought this is weird, you know, to start out with such an unconventional piece. But first of all, I love the essay. And I also am very fond of Hilton's writing in general. And I thought in some ways this really is an essay, even if it's in a voice that's not his own, you know. So that's one thing. And then there were experimental pieces like Anna Munson's piece, you know, which is all over the page like an exploding shrapnel. And lots of things that seem to be generated from lists, you know,
Mhm, mhm.
like Nicholson Baker has a piece about the summer, you know. Laura Kipnis has a very funny piece about the gulag of couples and all the things you can't do when you're in a couple. And I think that the list is a generative form that slips the knot of the argument, let's say.
Mhm.
You know, the essay that's based on the argument, which I think is a very valid form. Some people don't want to do that, you know, they don't want to build an argument. So the list becomes a kind of something similar to a poem in that it's associative, and you don't always know what the connection is from one line to the next. But then I think, since you spoke of the shock of the new, I think one of the real differences that I perceived in some of the contemporary essays from older essays
Yeah, yeah.
has to do with the handling of relationships. Um, you know, I don't think that older essayists were so inclined um, to tackle a relationship the way Megan Dam does with her mother in Matricide, or David Lazar has an essay about a woman he went out with who committed suicide, and Death and the Maiden. That seems to me something new that grows out of the primacy of the personal essay in the essay form.
Mm.
That is, I do think that that you know, over the last 30 years, 20 years, the personal essay has kind of nudged its way in, so that even a highly intellectual essay like Schiffer Schoen's piece um, about de Sade, Foucault, and so on, is really still about her marriage. So it's almost like, you know, there's so much more permission um, to write about personal experience and to turn it over and over, as Leslie does with her empathy exams, for
Mhm,
instance.
mhm, mhm.
I wonder if that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and I wonder too if and then I have a couple of questions just rising out of what you were just saying, Philip, which I found so fascinating. But I wonder if it's almost like there's a way that there's a kind of cycle around the personal essay where it has an ascendance and then a certain kind of backlash or a sense of kind of also maybe sometimes shame attached to the confessional mode or the personal mode,
Definitely.
or at least a kind of a sense of staleness that can attach to any form or any mode that then creates, okay, well, what's next? Like, okay, if the personal essay has become a form we're all familiar with, how do we sort of keep doing it in different ways and making
Modes,
the right
yeah.
application, which then leads to some of the hybridity that all of us teach around, that Margo teaches in the hybrid essay form, but the sort of personal either becoming this kind of kaleidoscopic turning around and around, or put in conversation with theory, or put in conversation with journalism or criticism. And I think, you know, probably all of us have feelings about the ways in which hybridity itself can become like faddish or a gesture. But I think that to me, it's fascinating to see how something kind of ascends, and then that almost puts a pressure on that form to keep being different in order to
Yeah.
Yeah, like one of the ways that I think it's been different. If you look at a piece like Samantha Irby's essay, she's very sassy. She's very she's very impolite, you could say. And so essayists are now, they're searching for something that's a bit contrarian, that's a bit confrontational, that maybe a little bawdy, you know. So you know that seems to me one of the ways that that personal essayists or or trying to reinvent the form. And some of it really comes out of the humor essay, like David Sedaris, you know, and the idea of not taking oneself so seriously. If you're writing about yourself, maybe one of the solutions um, is to be funny or to mock yourself, let's say, or to mock your reader.
Well, and maybe this particular thing you just said, and then Leslie had some more questions, seems to me to link up to the point you make in your introduction about how fiction, the short story, with its, you know, dramatizations, with the narrator who's so clearly a character, a persona, you know, I can get away with anything if I'm, you know, the narrator of the story. So we're claiming that license.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I love that movement in your intro, Philip, around, because it seemed to me just accurate and also interesting around the ways that somehow in essay writing circles, we seem to speak quite frequently about the conversation between poetry and the essay, or certainly the influences of poetry on like the lyric essay or the associative essay, and speak less about the conversation between sort of fiction and the short story. But of course, so many things that like were part of the new journalism, maybe in terms of scenes or dramatizing or creating characters, but that all of those are part of how we, you know, how a lot of people are thinking about putting essays together. And so I love that kind of, and even in terms of mode, like thinking about Laurie Moore as sort of like, certainly like Laurie Moore was like required reading for people who were getting MFAs when I got my MFA in early 21st century. And, you know, a certain kind of wry, intensely analytic, also self-deprecating mode, I think has become one of the tonalities available to the personal essay too. And so I thought it was so smart and right to bring that up. I was really interested in what you were saying about kind of, you know, in putting together these anthologies, thinking differently than just, you know, what you would pick up to read or the essays that you personally love, and trying to think about, you know, this real range of what essays are and what essays can do. And it made me wonder about the relationship for you between being a teacher and an anthology producer, or the ways in which, having been a teacher for so long and kind of shaped so many of your students, how your life as a teacher kind of inflected the way you put these anthologies together. Because it also strikes me that teaching is a realm in which we try to take seriously essays that are not the essays we ourselves would write or something. And so that kind of leaping across. But I was just interested in how teaching, sort of how you feel teaching shaped the way you put these anthologies together, maybe this one in particular, since it's so concerned with and how.
It's so integrated, my teaching and putting the anthologies together. The very first anthology that I did, The Art of the Personal Essay, came about because I was teaching the personal essay, and I kept Xeroxing mountains of material and also making my students buy many, many books. And I kept looking for an anthology to assign, and I realized there was nothing that was historical. The only anthologies that were out in the market were, at that point, in the 20th century. And I wanted to, because I'm very historically minded, that's just the way I am. I'm just very wedded to the past and interested in the past. I wanted to go back and do something that was historical, that in fact, you know, went back to the Greeks and Romans and Montaigne and so on. So I realized it was up to me to do it. And so then that anthology caught on, and a lot of teachers used it and was adopted all over the place. And when I was doing these three anthologies, I kept testing essays with my students. They were the canary in the mines, you know? It's interesting because in some cases they wouldn't like something, and that didn't necessarily mean that I would eliminate it. Maybe that was interesting. Maybe, you know, maybe maybe that's why it should go in, you know. But there were certain pieces that they loved, for instance.
Oh, drop some names here.
Well, like for instance, they loved this Bernard Cooper piece called "Greedy Sleep," which was about his lover who was dying of AIDS and his own preoccupation. They loved this piece by Thomas Bella called "Portrait of the Artist as a Young Bagel," which was about Bella working in a bagel shop. And all of them have had ridiculous jobs that they could connect with. They've all had stupid jobs, you know, and I love it. I love it when my students write about their jobs. I love, you know, descriptions of work, and I do feel in general in America that, you know, so much of literature is about people's love lives and about their time after work, and so much of their energy is given to their work lives, you know. So to me, that really hit the spot, you know. Those are two examples of things that they really liked, you know. So, and you know, I mean, I also taught Rivka Galchin's piece about her daughter and her, and it's a very funny piece, and they seem to like that a lot. So I was teaching a course with undergraduates last term, and undergraduates can be very solemn, self-righteous, and serious. And so all the better to throw some funny or ironic essays at them, just to give them permission. Yes, and graduate students too. Yes, give them permission to take some distance from themselves. And I will say that naturally, since I edited this contemporary American essay, it's in spite of my attempt to be open to everything, it's going to reflect my tastes, and it's going to reflect my perspective. So one of the elements of my perspective is perspective. That is, I want the essayist to be able to have a little bit of detachment, and you know, not to be able to be worldly, and not just to see himself or herself, you know, being crucified by, you know, the problems that they're having. So yes, my own essays tend to usually have some humor, and so some element of detachment, some element of irony, and some element of perspective usually grabbed me and gave me, you know, a connection with a piece.
Mhm.
That if that speaks to a limitation of mine, then I acknowledge it, you know. Worldliness, because I think that the essayist cannot be a naive, cannot be a primitive, has to be on some level disenchanted, even if ultimately re-enchanted.
Well, and I wonder, one of the questions I was curious about, which I think is connected to this kind of I guess the question of taste and maybe the question of surprise, is I'm wondering whether there are essays in this collection that were essays that sort of you grew to love over time, or that somehow surprised you in the love you came to have for them, whether it was sort of an essay that struck you initially as like, oh, this is not my cup of tea, and then you were like, well, maybe I like other kinds of tea than I thought I liked, or something, which of course happens to me, whether that happened over the course of putting together the anthology or sort of preceded the putting together of the anthology. But I'm curious what some of those pieces are for you. Well,
yes, I mean, since you know, you had mentioned to me how much you loved the Brian Doyle piece, I put in Brian Doyle initially because people whose opinion I respected really liked him a lot. And I have a slightly phobic relationship to nature essays. But I recognize that they are one of the major strands of American essay writing. And so I read this essay I read a lot of Brian Doyle, and this particular essay struck me as so joyous and lyrical, and the prose was so great, put it that way, that I thought, okay, you know, let's put this in. And then the same thing would be true for Barry Lopez. Barry Lopez is, who died recently, was a very solid, respected nature writer. And not too many laughs in Barry Lopez. You can bring her into the discussion. But I respected his writing, yes, sometimes even faculty get a little self-serious. True enough. So I really felt that it was very much worth putting in, And I also wanted to do this generational thing, which is I didn't just want to have writers in their 30s and 40s. I wanted to say that there were still some old timers around, in the 21st century, who are part of the scene. And so I put in Joyce Carol Oates and Barry Lopez and John McPhee. I had always wanted to put John McPhee in the first two volumes, and I couldn't find exactly the right essay. And then I was able to find something for the third one. So, we're all inhabiting the earth at the same time and influencing each other. And some are older, some are younger, But in general, I wonder if I could throw out a question to you guys, like, since I admitted myself as someone who was very enthralled with the past and with the traditions of the personal essay, of the essay in general, how much do you think the contemporary American essayist is well versed in that tradition, and how much not? That is, do you think that that the contemporary essayists, like Gia Tarantino, or reading Hazlitt and Lamb, or do you think they need to, or what's your sense of how alive the tradition is among the current practitioners?
Well, one part of that question, it seems to me, has to do with how the essay, in its most, historically confined aspects, and in its most now, hither and thither and every which way, it's never in America been taught with the focus, the concentration, the sort of, okay, here's a canon, even when we're changing it, that the novel has, even that theater
Poetry
has, up to a certain point, certainly poetry. So how much, how much reading have even the, the now dead major practitioners, how much were they doing? They weren't being taught very much when they were coming along, reading in the library or going, in universities. They weren't, not at all. Didn't you? When did you started reading, I would think, both of you, essays fairly informally?
Yes, I mean,
they were not part of the canon, and the canon has changed wildly, but they still are not. You're not taught in experimental canons that also recognize race, gender, sexuality. The essay still is kind of hobbling. We drag it into these.
Well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, because I do think that now that these, issues of race and gender and disability and so on the table, the essay becomes one of the places that these questions are explored. It's very useful
because it is not a fully canonized form. I think that's absolutely right.
Not a fully contaminized form.
Canonized is what I meant to say. Canonical form.
Canonical. Yeah. Okay, so let's just.
I mean, I started reading when I wasn't reading essays in college. When I got out of college, I went to I went back to Baldwin. I went to Ralph Ellison's essays. I went to Mary McCarthy. I went to George Orwell. I went even to people like Doris Lessing. I was looking for, exciting voices that were being essayistic. I was looking for novelists who were just as potent as essayists.
But if you look at someone like Mary McCarthy or James Baldwin, you can hear in their voices gravitas that comes from their education.
Yes, but their education was not wholly did not include as much essay writing, I suspect, as.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But I feel when I'm reading a Mary McCarthy essay, I know that she studied Latin, and I feel in her sentences a Latinate approach to syntax, and in Baldwin, I feel his obsession with Henry James and with the Bible and with Dickens. You feel
his diction, his syntax, absolutely. Yeah,
it's at the level of
preacherly tradition. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So, but I do think that that because you met, look, let's just back off a second and look at this question of the canon. Okay, now, canon has become a dirty word, right?
It depends on what adjectives precede it. Depends on how it's qualified. I think we think about canons a lot. We like it to be more flexible. We
want it to be more flexible.
Yes.
Like, when I did the first volume, The Glorious American Essay, I thought to myself, this is an exercise in canon building. This is I am trying to say that this is what's worth carrying on into the next period of time. So, we don't, we need Emerson,
shows up in your essay in this volume.
Right. We need Emerson, but we also need some of these more obscure writers like Randolph Bourne, for instance, James Weldon Johnson, in order, like, it's so interesting to look at James Weldon Johnson and his essay, and then look at those by Teju Cole and Darrell Pinckney or yours, and say how these predecessors, are speaking to or in conversation with their descendants,
So you're also talking about all of us finding our own particular canons, or at least, streams of influence within this larger. Yeah.
Right. So when I wrote in the introduction that I was totally chicken. I said, I'm not making a canon. I'm offering a smorgasbord. I mean, who could resist a smorgasbord? The feast, But in my own mind, I think, damn it, I'm trying to do a canon,
Well, and I think, it's interesting because just as you're talking now, I'm thinking that so much of the work that I think these anthologies collectively are doing are pushing back against any kind of binary idea of like sort of believing in the canon has to mean upholding an extremely skewed and limited canon that has sort of like held sway for many years, or completely destroying that canon in order to make way for something else that is in fact doing the work of saying like, yeah, when we read Baldwin, we are also seeing a writer deeply in conversation with Dickens, with the Bible, with the lineage, like that that
And also with Richard Wright, and also with, with his own father, the preacher. Yeah.
so it's sort of like, and with so many, even so many of the more, I mean, because Baldwin, is certainly canonical as well, but it's like to think about, to think about the way that even writers that, readers might not have encountered or heard of before they open the pages for your anthology. And one of my other questions for you is like, who are some of the writers where you were sort of like, this person has not gotten their due and I want to install them in the canon where they might not otherwise be? I'm curious who those writers are for you.
Yeah, exactly.
But like these people are actually already inside of this lineage and conversation. That seems to me sort of like much more interesting than this binary of like either reify the canon that is or destroy that canon to make way for something else, and more like, no, there are all these voices that are already a part of this conversation that we maybe just haven't been seeing.
Yes.
Like for instance, I mean, in the Glorious American Essay, I put in this writer named Martin Delaney. Martin Delaney was the rival, I would say, of Frederick Douglass. He was the un-Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was saying, we need to integrate this country. And Martin Delaney was saying, fat chance, this country will never, he was an African-American. He said, this country will never accept blacks. Let's get the hell out of here to Canada or Liberia. That was Martin Delaney's position. Happened to be a very good writer. And I love the idea of putting somebody who, Frederick Douglass is already in the canon, but Martin Delaney is not in the canon,
Not in the literary one, right? He's been confined to history. Yeah,
he's in the history, absolutely. I'm sure that you're very familiar with him, but I mean, most he's not in the he's not in the belletristic.
Exactly, and which is you did that a number of times with various writers. That was interesting. Yeah.
Yes, and one of the things I was trying to do was to break the bars of the essay so that it wouldn't just be the belletristic essay by the literary author, but that would include historians, theologians, geographers, politicians, and so on, with the idea that a good essay, can come from anywhere. So I wanted to. So that was one of the ways that I was trying to challenge the canon by expanding it, you could say.
Yeah. And you are establishing sites, various flexible canonical sites for the essay, which we, have already acknowledged has been kind of pushed here and there, and But Leslie also asked you. You named Delaney, but she asked about other writers you felt just had not been given their due, and I think that's interesting.
There was this actually beautiful nature writer named Mary Austin, really a good writer.
Yeah.
And she, it just so happened I was visiting a college, and there was this dinner afterwards, and those of you who do these gigs know that can be the most painful part of the whole thing, that is, you give your reading and then you really want to go back to your hotel, watch TV, but instead you have to do this dinner,
You're always slipping out saying there's a baseball game on. Yeah.
Yes.
An infant is really convenient.
So I was sitting next to this guy, and he asked about my project, and I told him, and he said, have you ever read Mary Austin? I said, no, and of course, I went home, I ordered the book, I loved it, and the same thing happened again with at a wedding where I was sitting next to a guy. Maybe Margo, you'll tell me this. The guy who wrote the book about the word Negro.
You mean the lawyer?
Yeah.
Randall.
Randall Kennedy.
Yes, Randall, yeah, Randall Kennedy, yeah.
Randall Kennedy.
Kennedy, yeah.
So I was sitting next to Randall Kennedy, and he said, I had my mentor was this guy, Robert K. Merton, the sociologist, and he was a terrific writer, and he would correct my papers. You should look him up. And so I did, and I found this wonderful essay, The Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. He's somebody who is revered among sociologists, but literary people don't know him at all. Now, when it comes to the contemporary scene, I'm trying to see if there are people who I feel have not gotten their due. There are people who I'm very fond of, like Emily Fox Gordon, for instance, who isn't all that well known among essayists, So, but in a way, I was trying to respond to the taste of the moment, much more. So I wasn't necessarily in this book trying to find people who were invisible, In fact, I wanted to put in people who were quite visible, like Maggie Nelson or Eula Biss, because I felt that they were part of the conversation, and they needed to be in it. Or Rebecca Solnit, for instance. She's very prominent. She's part of the conversation, So I think I was going after something different with this book.
Leslie, I'm curious. Philip and I talked a little. Well, Philip, you didn't fully. I mentioned who I was first reading when I became conscious of reading, essays for my own passion. I'd like to ask both of you who, which essayists you found your own way as a curious and passionate reader too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was thinking about my own kind of first acquaintances with the essay when you were talking a bit about your question earlier, Philip, about how much contemporary essayists are sort of consciously engaging with the lineage of the essay and essays from the past. And I certainly I would say that my own literary background as a reader it just feels so multi-genre rather than being kind of, so in a way, I guess it's echoing some of what Margo was saying, that in my particular life, and part of that comes from the fact that like I spent a while in academia and my focus wasn't essays at all. It was largely novels and fiction, a lot of
that's what you wrote first.
Fiction, and so I think I sort of, but part of actually what was exciting to me when I first started writing essays was like that I hadn't read that many of them, and it was sort of like there was something that was energizing to me about actually not feeling so much of the pressure of being in a tradition, which is not to say that I have not kind of engaged with that tradition and don't feel like so excited by all of the tremendous things that have been written and are still being written in the essay form, but that I just remember having spent so much time in thinking about fiction, reading fiction, feeling my brain sort of like rattling around with voices from my fiction workshops saying like, this is what a good scene looks like, this is what a bad scene looks like. Not to say that all workshops necessarily kind of produce any sort of group thing, because I think we all believe in workshopping and believe in the kind of vitality and diversity of what can produce. But I liked kind of feeling really like I was in this wilderness and I didn't exactly know what had already happened there. And there was something that felt very freeing about just kind of like, oh, you mean I can just do this and then do that? And I don't mean to sort of romanticize like naivete or ignorance or anything like that, but I just, that was definitely a part of the excitement of the essay for me at first, was feeling like it didn't have such an entrenched, at least in my personal exposure, such an entrenched lineage, or there was a sort of freedom in it that I think had something to do with the form itself and the way that it can hold so many different kinds of inquiry, and something to do with just not knowing that well, like, you know, what the tradition was. That said, you know, a writer who was quite inspiring and influential to me early on, who, I don't know whether you guys agree with this, I feel like he's talked about a lot less than he was maybe 20 years ago, was John D'Agata. And, you know, I know he's gotten sort of famous for other things around factuality since then, but I just really loved his essays. Excited me. They felt weird and like they were just doing exactly what they wanted. I remember his essay, I still teach this essay sometimes, his essay on Henry Darger, the outsider artist from Chicago.
And I sometimes teach his essay on Martha Graham.
Yeah. He, you know, the essays in Halls of Fame especially just were,
I actually wrote about those when I was at the Times briefly, but you know, the books, then he went on to do the essay collections, which I also taught from. I would, for several years, where the only books my students would get would be Philip's anthology and John's anthology, and then random pieces that I would.
You know, I would just say that I think what you're saying, Leslie, is really true, and it's part of what the attraction of the essay, which is it is an experiment. You know, it's to essay is to try out something. And it's a form that has been under theorized. That is, in fiction you have narratology, you know, and in poetry you have prosody. A lot of, you know, and to its credit or discredit, the essay has never been pinned down so that we, you know, nobody is saying. You know, at 3/4 of the way up the mountain, that's where you have to do the reversal, you know? So it really, even though I read as much as I could of essays, I had much the same feeling you did, which was I'm in the wilderness. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just going to try to explore it, see where it takes me. I don't have to know when I'm beginning where I'm going to go. So that launching into the unknown is really part of the excitement of essay writing.
Well, and I have a really kind of a selfish question that maybe I'll just direct to you guys more as practitioners of the essay form. And then I know that we also have a couple questions from other people who are here. But I mean, I guess I'm curious how both of you who have been writing wonderful essays for far longer than I have, how do you guys get yourselves back to that place of like, I'm in the wilderness and I'm just figuring out what this can be? And because I've actually found in recent years, which is part of why I'm actually not so much writing. Right now I'm working on a novel and a sort of splintery work of nonfiction, but I've actually, I realized at a certain point I was getting tired of my shtick. Like I felt like I had a thing that I did and it involved personal narrative and cultural history. And it's not to say that anything I was doing, I was phoning in. I care about each and every essay I've written, but I was sort of like, oh, I have this mode, you know, and people would be like, oh, somebody asked me to do like a Leslie Jamison piece on this. And I was like, oh my God, like, how do I get back to that way I felt when I was 23? And I was like, I can do whatever I want. And I don't know what I'm doing. And it was so exciting and alive. And so I think I'm thinking a lot about how do we get ourselves back to that dynamic newness in forms we've been working with for a while.
I find I have found that I had to pull back. I didn't write the Michael Jackson. I didn't finish it till I'd left the Times. You know, then I would freelance, but I found when I'm really immersed in a book, you know, that I want to push myself, I want to do something surprising with, I pull back on the journalistic essays. For me, you know, it's usually a critical essay of some sort. I just don't do it nearly as much because it pulls out my shtick. It's like, okay, you know, my version of Cocktail Party, Margo, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's my way of handling it. What about you, Philip?
Well, some of it is trying to invent tasks or problems that you haven't done yet. So, so I wrote a few, you could say book length essays like the Notes on Sontag or
Mhm.
Waterfront, you know. So some of it is like trying to find a subject that will go further than 10 or 20 pages, you know.
Yeah, and a book length essay is really useful that way. Yeah.
Book length essays are useful, but I think that the problem that you're raising, Leslie, is true for poets as well as fiction writers. You know, like how do they stop imitating themselves? How do they get past their shtick? And I think for me, um, I I accept that I do imitate myself. So I'm not gonna
I
beat myself
imitate
up.
myself. Well, then I imitate
Yes,
myself.
exactly. Do I contradict myself? Very well. Yes, I do imitate myself, and it's a form of modesty or humility that I think. Well, why should I be original every time? You know.
Yeah.
I mean, uh, for me, there's still the shoemaker side of me, which is, well, I got this piece of leather and I'm going to try to shape it. And I'm going to try to make it into a good pair of shoes.
Mhm.
And, you know, I'll do the best I can. And is it going to, you know, come from that same place of wonder that when I first started? Probably not. I have so many tricks by now, you
Mm.
know. You know, when you've been writing as long as I have, you can't help it. You know, you start to see a way through the thicket, you know.
Mhm.
So you can't deny that knowledge or
Mm.
that craft, you know. Um, but I would say I would just go back to, you know, the British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott saying about the good enough mother, you know. So this is like the good enough essay, you know.
Yeah, I love that.
Got it. I like it too.
About
I like
Winnicott
that a lot.
quite often around mother. Or
I
maybe
give it to you. Don't forget.
Yeah, yeah.
Should we, do you think, should we offer you, Philip, some of these lovely questions? I see
Sure.
Naomi in the chat, who I think probably we have all worked with at some point.
There we go. Yeah.
Let's go to the questions. Yes.
Yeah, Naomi Falk. Hi Naomi.
Oh my goodness, Naomi, so nice to hear from you.
I know, it's so great that she's here. She asks, where do you weigh in on the great/exhausted internet debate about young generations lacking the attention span of their predecessors? How do you think this has altered the nature of the essay for younger writers?
Well, not being a younger writer, it would be hard for me to be able to say whether my attention span had shriveled or not. You know, I was very dubious about the idea of the blog, you know, and then I was asked to keep a blog, and I did for a year for American Scholar, and you know, I discovered that when you're writing a blog, it's very similar to writing an essay, you know, maybe shorter, you know. So I think that there will always be young readers who, you know, who have long attention spans and who love books. And to some degree, you know, great literature has always been a niche pursuit, not something for everybody. So I think that that maybe some younger people don't have long attention spans, and maybe I myself don't have a long attention span. I do like essays, short essays. You know, I seem to have bogged down in the middle of volume 3 of Proust. So so maybe I have problems with attention span, but I basically think that on the internet, there are some beautiful pieces of prose being written and some dreck, you know, and that's true of poetry. It's true of novels, you know. the bad stuff is always going to outnumber the good stuff. But I wouldn't think that we're living through a mutation, and that young people are, you know, that young people are so different from us.
Well, our next anonymous attendee's question actually says, what do you see your students responding to now? And has that changed? How has it changed?
Well, I certainly think that a lot of young people in colleges now have a highly ethical sense regarding race, gender, questions of appropriation, imperialism, and so on. And sometimes they like reading pieces that confirm them in their opinions. It's like a checklist almost, you know.
That's always been true of certain kinds of, argument and polemical essays, and the readers who, we want to be confirmed.
Exactly. But I would say I can never quite predict what my students are going to like, you know. Well, how do you feel about that, Margo?
No, I agree with you. It surprises me, particularly when you give them old things, what will absolutely light somebody up, or who will get very daring, who hasn't been. Very, very hard to tell.
Exactly. Like, I remember teaching Max Beerbaum's essays, and I think most of the responses was meh, so what? And one student was it changed her life, She just wanted to read all of Max Beerbaum and write like Max Beerbaum.
Oh, good Lord. Okay. Appropriate Max Beerbaum.
Exactly.
Okay.
You don't mind.
That's right. You got one more from Minna Hamedi. So amazing to see you all. Well, thank you for that. What do you think, this goes to Philip, is the mark of a strong essay collection beyond a certain cohesive, that's in quotes, element?
Maybe cohesiveness is not so important, I think, to encounter living voices, even if they've been dead for centuries, and to realize, as Leslie's been saying, how much freedom there is in the form.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, I feel like I have learned a lot from you on that front, Philip, through just the process of being your colleague, that I feel like I'll be in conversations with students who have spoken to you about, thinking about what their essay collections can become. And I feel like you are a really wonderful voice agitating on this front in a great way, that like there's a sort of a feeling of pressure sometimes around thematic cohesion, or the sort of like elevator pitch version of an essay collection. And, maybe there are all these kind of marketing, publishing industry forces that would contribute to that. But that, actually there can be a way that some of the collections that are most compelling, it's like because of their prickliness and their multiplicity of direction. And I mean, I remember when I was putting together empathy exams, feeling a lot of hesitancy about putting in this one essay that was about an ultra marathon, because it was like this sports essay and it was so different from a lot of the more interpersonal essays. And it's like, oh my God, there's some people where it's like the only essay they like in the book, but actually having something that's so different and that doesn't quite belong makes the whole thing more interesting, and kind of fills out the possibilities of what a collection can be, that it's not hemmed in the same ways that continuous narrative, no matter what the genre is. So,
and what a writer can do,
Yeah. I always have to smile when I read a review of an essay collection and they say it's uneven. Duh, yeah, of course,
Yeah.
But that's part of the pleasure,
As is virtually any novel one would read. Uneven, okay.
Uneven, yes. But that I think that it used to be understood that essay collections were an opportunity to engage with a friend, a friendly voice that would try out all different kinds of problems, some much more important than others, you know? And that was part of the pleasure, to see how a writer would tackle something that is not, you know, coming from their main vein, let's say.
And maybe the friendly voice has moved more as the essay and its history and its practitioners move to a compelling voice, you know? Even if it's a frightening or unsettling or discomforting voice, it compels.
Yeah, true. So long may they reign. Yes.
Yes, and you have done this state some service. Yes.
Well,
And we know
that's
it.
great.
Thank
That's
you, guys.
We got our copies.
It graces my shelves with its July colors of patriotism. It's a wonderful, wonderful anthology, Philip. Such a pleasure
It
to
is.
talk to you about it.
And it's part of, you've got, it's a lineage, it's a tradition. Yeah, you've got it now. I've got all your essay collections.
Now we're up to the present, and you can buy copies at Powerhouse, signed by Philip, who walked down here from his house. Thank you so much. This was an excellent conversation. Thank you, Leslie and Margo and Philip, and we'll have this on YouTube for anybody who missed any of it.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
You guys are the
much,
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, audience, for joining us. Yes.
Yes.
And thank you, Margo and Leslie, so much.
Thank you, Philip and Leslie. Good to see you. Good to talk. Bye.
Bye.